what happened to a certain expensive gun that used to belong to, that was in the Mark Shields collection, that was ordered destroyed. And tell us what happened, and what did you do to research, and can you actually verify that it was destroyed? Tell me all the hoops that you went through.
Right. Well, let me give you a little background into this case. Back in 2009, approximately, right before that, I had taken off overseas, and when I came back in 2010, I was informed by Mark Shields that he runs the Whole Food store in Cherokee County off of 19129. It's a health food store. He had told me how his house had been raided, and 80 plus guns were taken from him by the sheriff's office in what he called it, a phony search warrant, and that the case was dismissed shortly afterwards, but he never got his weapons back. So he mentioned it to me, and we talked about it a little bit, and months later, years later, just recently this year in 2014, the beginning of the year, he mentioned it again to me. And I told him I thought he had gotten his guns back after the case had been dismissed, and I thought the judge would have ordered the guns returned. He explained to me, no, they weren't returned, that they were ordered to be destroyed. And I thought that was very unusual since he was acquitted. And I mentioned to him, why didn't they not get returned to you? And he explained, well, it's something to do with he was a former convicted felon, and the judge could not have these weapons returned. So I explained to him that it could have been.
Let's interject. He was growing pot. It wasn't like he was laundering money or robbing banks. He was a pot grower.
He was a pot grower for personal use.
Okay. And since then, he runs a successful health food store. He's an asset to the community.
Correct.
He's a naturopath, almost like you could call him a naturopathic doctor.
Yes. So
any of these detractors that want to put him down for his past 30 years ago, because he's a valuable member of the Cherokee County Society.
That's correct. So he's a good, the husband and wife, they're good people. Like you said, they're contributing members to the county.
And the pot growing was 30 years ago.
Right. And, as we know, the whole country is changing, and they're becoming more tolerant of that, and they're allowing personal use of it. I don't hold that against him, is what I'm saying. And that was no reason to take all his weapons. And
it was on hearsay from a person that was later found to be stalking, and she actually got arrested for stalking. So it was not a credible witness.
No, the witness was so incredible that she once called the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office and claimed to the deputies that Burt Reynolds was peeking in through her window. So if that gives you any idea, that's what kind of a witness she was.
This is what they barged into Mark Shields' home, on her word.
On her word and another person's word that was not a established confidential informant. Those are the reasons why the case was dismissed as a faulty search warrant. They call it a defective search warrant.
Okay.
There was no credibility to do the search warrant to begin with.
Why don't you explain the expression that you've used before, because a lot of people don't know what that means. In other words, some police departments, they don't care so much about the value of the information as long as they get the booty. What was that expression you used?
That you may beat the rap, but you won't beat the ride.
Okay, what does that mean? In other words, you may not be able to win in court, but you've got all this booty, guns, money, or whatever, that goes back to the sheriff or the sheriff's department.
Correct.
That he keeps.
What it really means is you may win in court, most likely because it's a defective search warrant or defective arrest, but the law enforcement agency at that point is not worried about that. All they care about is seizing the property and the assets for personal gain, or to basically harass someone. In other words, it's to say, hey, we're in control, we're in power, and we have the power to do this to you. And you may beat the rap in court, but guess what? You're going for the ride. You're going to have to get an attorney. You're going to have to spend lots of money. You're not going to get your property back. So it's a form of harassment. It's a violation of your constitutional rights, okay? Because it's an unreasonable search and seizure.
So you did a records request on the whole hoard or catch of what was seized in Mark Shields' house. You did a records request, and explain what What were the results?
Okay, when I first met Mark this at the beginning of this year, and he told me about the seizure, he provided me with most of the records that he had in his possession. And I reviewed them. And he says, look at this. Here's the seizure sheet, the inventory of what was seized during the April of 2009 when they raided the house. I believe it was April. And then he showed me how a lot of the serial numbers didn't match. So I went further, one step further, and I went to the clerk's office. And I obtained all the records that I could obtain there from destruction of weapons that was ordered by the court, and I compared that to the inventory of the seizure. And what I found was that there was over 3 to 4 or 5 guns that serial numbers did not match. They were either missing the correct digits, more than 1 or 2 digits, and sometimes the whole serial number was wrong. And then we looked at it further and further, checking off all the items, and we found there was a missing weapon that was not one weapon that was not on the destruction sheet.
Was there any video evidence to show that they actually did destroy these guns?
There was no video evidence.
So it's just we have to take the sheriff's word.
Correct. And let me explain that a little bit. The reason there's no video evidence, and I bring the video evidence up, is I spoke to former deputies with the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office that were evidence custodians. And I asked them, when you guys destroy evidence, particularly guns, do you videotape it or photograph it? And they said, sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. So there's no continuity within the sheriff's office. There's no consistency. And I think a lot of that lacks because they don't have a real good departmental order book, a standard operating procedure book.
SOP book.
Right, they don't have one. They claim they have one. I worked there for 4 years. I never saw one. It's not something like when they swear you in, here's your gun, your badge, here's your SOP book. Never got one. So deputies are basically winging it. And I think the SOP basically is retained in the sheriff's head, whatever he considers to be the SOP of the day. Does that make any sense? But that's the way they do it here.
All right, so then whatever they claim was destroyed, but there was one that was not on the list.
Correct.
This was an expensive gun?
Very expensive Uzi, Israeli Uzi machine gun that was made in Israel. It was a collector's item, brand new in the box, never fired, in a case with an extra barrel, and I think it was a flash suppressor or something. It came with accessories. Very nice, mint condition, and very valuable. Probably the most valuable gun in the collection. And it was not on the destruction sheet. So what happens next is I go and visit the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office, and I put in a records request. And they offered me the destruction sheet once again.
This was an additional records request.
Yes. And I spoke to Roger Williams at first. He's the one that gave me the records request. He was a detective there. I think he's in charge of the jail now. And he gave me the records requests. I glanced through them in the lobby, and he asked me, is there anything else you need? And I said, no, let me look through it a minute. And he did ask the question. He goes, why are you interested in this? And I said, because I'm reviewing this for Mr. Shields as a pro bono, just no charge, just as out of kindness of my heart. He asked me as a former investigator, not only here but in another state, that I would review the case. And I asked him then, did you videotape the destruction of this property? He says, I don't know. I wasn't the one who destroyed it. And then he asked me, why are you so interested to know that? I said, I'm interested in knowing your procedures, because I understand sometimes you video, sometimes you don't. There's no SOP, so that's why I asked that, with all due respect, Mr. Williams. And then I asked to see Tony Dickey, which is now the current evidence custodian. And he went and got him, and I spoke to him. And what Tony Dickey told me at that time was that all the weapons were destroyed in that case. And I asked him again, are you absolutely sure? He says, absolutely. Every weapon was destroyed. He says, I'm not going to jeopardize my job, my pension from the Highway Patrol, to misappropriate any weapons. We destroyed every weapon. I said, okay, just want to make sure for the record, that's what happened. And then I left at that time. And I continued to review the reports and put in a second records request shortly after that for more information on the case and including other people involved to that case. And that records request took about 4 weeks, well, almost a month to get it back. But before the records request came through, I had a conversation with Joe Wood, who's the chief deputy for the sheriff, over at the courthouse one night.
The current one.
The current one.
He's been through several.
Right.
Okay, the current chief deputy.
That's correct. And we met at the courthouse after a commission meeting. We were in the courtroom, and I said, Joe, I'd like to speak to you about this case I put in a records request for, and I haven't gotten it. And it's been 3 weeks. He says, well, Ed, you know, the court has never determined what a reasonable amount of time is for us to produce a records request. And I said, I understand that may be true, but come on, 3 weeks? A month? What is reasonable? He says, well, I'll look into it. And then we got in a very involved conversation about the Shields case. And he said to me, what is it you're looking for, Ed? I said, well, you'll find out when I find it. And I'll tell you. And we went back and forth, and I told him there was something there that we're looking at, but I needed all the records requests before I can arrive at any conclusion. And I told him, I'm not saying that you guys have done anything wrong, and I'm just following the paper trail, the evidence, and we'll see where it falls. And he proceeded to tell me that if there's anything wrong in this case, you have to remember that the current deputies that were involved in this case, the task force, are no longer with us. So they would be the ones that did something wrong. And I argued with him. I said, no, the sheriff was in command at the time, so the buck stops with him. Don't pass it off on the task force. And then he proceeded to tell me, well, the task force commander's gone, all the deputies are gone, we eliminated them all. I said, that does not take away from the fact that the sheriff was in charge, and today you have a new evidence custodian, and that does not take away from fault if anything is wrong. And he kept playing that back and forth with me, and I said, so he kept asking me, what is it you're looking for? I said, well, we went back and forth, and we said some things that were confidential about, you know, having some other people involved in our conversation if I were to bring that up. And finally, it led to the end of the conversation when I said, you know what, Joe? He said to me, you need to trust me, Joe said. I said, well, if I'm going to trust you, you need to trust me. And I finally said to him, why don't you review your inventory of seizure and compare it to your destruction report and get back to me and see what you find. So the following day, I call him, and he says, I reviewed it, Ed. I don't see anything wrong. And I said, Joe, either you didn't look at it like you said you did, or you missed it. So look at it again. This was a Tuesday. And then on Wednesday, I called him right before lunch, around 11:30. This was a couple weeks ago. And I said, did you review it? Again. He says, yes, I did. And I found what you're looking for. I said, what is that, Joe? And he says, the Uzi machine gun. I said, no kidding. You found it, huh? So can you tell me where that Uzi machine gun is? And he says, yes, we found it in our evidence room. And I said, so after a year and a half of the weapon that was ordered to be destroyed, you now found it in your evidence room? He says, that's correct. I said, well, let me ask you a favor. Out of professional courtesy, because I have worked for you guys, we've worked together, and as a citizen of Cherokee County, since this weapon was in your evidence room, it was missed for a year and a half, would you please hold it for one more day, just one more day? And I would like to contact the victim, Mark Shields, to see if his attorney can get it back. He says, absolutely not. I said, so what are you going to do with it? He says, we're going to destroy it. I go, you can't wait an extra day? He says, no, we're going to destroy it. I said, one extra day only, Joe. And he said, absolutely not. And then he said, I don't have the authority to stop the destruction. I said, well, if I get somebody with authority, maybe we can stop it.
An injunction of some sort.
Right. So he proceeded to tell me to call Tony Dickey. And I said, okay. So I called Tony Dickey on the phone. He gave me his cell number. I asked him the same request, and he says, no, I can't do anything for you. You don't have the authority. We're going to destroy it immediately. I said, why? He says, because we have a court order. I said, that court order was a year and a half ago, and you guys missed it. And if it wasn't for me, you wouldn't even know you had that gun right now. And that's one of the things that Joe says, yeah, thank you, Ed, for finding that for us, but we're destroying it. So anyways, Tony Dickey hung up the phone on me, didn't even finish the conversation with me. I ran down to the courthouse to see if I could find a judge to stop the destruction.
Get a court injunction.
Some kind of to stop the destruction, explain to the judge what had happened. And unfortunately, all the judges were in conference that day for the week. I couldn't even get a DA. They were in conference. Everybody was in conference. Anyways, ran down to the newspaper, see if they had the ability at least to go see the weapon before it got destroyed, or be there during the destruction, because they wouldn't allow me to be there during the destruction of the weapon, or even see the weapon, to determine the weapon even existed. And so the newspaper called, and they told them, absolutely not. You cannot see it. You cannot see it. And by the way, it's a mute subject at this point. The weapon's already been destroyed. And this happened within an hour of my request not to destroy it. So at that point, what ran through my mind is, how do we know even the weapon existed? Because we're taking their word.
All right. Now, you say you were able to go to the bin where it was supposedly after it was all done?
No, not the bin. I went to the landfill.
You went to the landfill.
Right.
And you're saying, could you possibly identify the remains without
any doubt?
Any doubt?
No, I could not.
You cannot say yes. There was no serial number you could identify.
When I went there, sure enough, there was an Uzi machine gun there that had just been cut in half within the last hour, and it was cut in half. But they took the torch and they cut it and they melted off where the serial number would have been. And so there was no evidence on the gun that I could tell that it was the original gun. In fact, the gun looked so beat up that it didn't even come across to me as a brand new gun like it was described in the case. So for all we know today, the gun has been buried since in the landfill. For all we know, it could have been another Uzi.
Could have been a different gun.
Exactly. But what's most alarming about this case is, to me, and I hope people pick up on this, is there's a destruction of weapons in 2012, 2012, for all the weapons by the judge, because they could not return them to the custody of someone who was a convicted felon. I understand that. But what could have been argued, and it wasn't, was that those weapons could have been transferred to an FFL dealer, a licensed dealer, who then could have sold the guns legitimately. And with that money could have been used to pay for Mark's defense, that he had to spend over $50,000 to defend himself in a case that was fraudulent to begin with. That's number one. The court's argument is we can't give them to anyone else because they could be given back to a felon like Mark. Well, if it's given to an FFL dealer, they're prohibited by law to give the guns back to anyone who's a convicted felon. By law, every gun, when it's transferred from an FFL dealer, they have to do a background on them. So that would have been the perfect thing, the honorable thing by the sheriff to have done, to return them to a designated FFL dealer where Mark could have retrieved his cost from the fraudulent search warrant. But they did the dishonorable thing. They took his weapons under a fraudulent search warrant, and then they destroyed them. A collection worth probably, who knows, over 50 grand.
Over 50,000.
I don't know. It was an immense collection, 80 plus guns. Okay, collector's items. In fact, there was one in there that was 1895, and technically guns before 1898 are not considered weapons. They're considered collector's items, like a black powder gun. They can be owned by a convicted felon, and that was destroyed. There was a lot of things destroyed that had nothing to do with the gun, like the cases, brand new cases. There was other things that were taken that had nothing to do with the case whatsoever, and they were never returned. Now, what I wanted to bring up is if that weapon was in their evidence room for over a year and a half and it went unmissed. It went missed. I question that. Was it in somebody's private collection? And then when I discovered it, all of a sudden it appears? Because we'll never know the truth now. And most importantly this is where the shabby police work comes in. Every FFL dealer and anybody who's any accredited sheriff's police department does an inventory of their evidence room yearly, if not every 6 months. They go through every case number, item ID tag, and they verify what's in the evidence room related to what case. They don't even do that. If they would have done an inventory a year ago, they would have said, hey, we have an Uzi here. It should have been destroyed under this case number, and it wasn't. We need to destroy it immediately. They didn't do that. So it took like someone like myself from the outside with no access to the inside to look at paperwork and say, hey, there's something wrong here. And it's how ironic it was the most expensive gun. It's like that gun was chosen as a trophy weapon to be put in someone's collection. That's my suspicion. It gets discovered, and immediately it gets brought back into the evidence room and says, we have to destroy it immediately because we're in violation of a court order.